I stood at the entrance of the luxury real estate auction, my Cartier watch, the last remnant of my former life, gleaming under the crystal chandeliers, while a portfolio of carefully orchestrated plans sat heavy in my designer briefcase. The same briefcase that had once carried divorce papers now held the blueprint of my revenge, documents proving my ability to buy every single property my ex-husband had ever dreamed of owning. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The irony wasn't lost on me as I remembered how he had left me with nothing but debt and broken promises just 18 months ago. The opulent ballroom of the Four Seasons buzzed with the quiet murmur of San Francisco's elite real estate investors, their wealthy whispers echoing off marble columns and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered panoramic views of the bay. Golden autumn sunlight streamed through the glass, catching the rim of my untouched champagne flute, a prop I'd been holding for the past hour while studying the room with calculated precision. I adjusted the sleeve of my black Chanel blazer, a recent investment in my new persona, and felt the weight of dozens of curious glances. To them, I was a mystery, the unknown woman who had appeared on their radar 6 months ago, methodically acquiring properties across the city's most prestigious neighborhoods. But to the man who had just walked through the door, I was supposed to be nothing more than a distant memory, a cautionary tale of financial ruin. Alexander Reynolds strode into the room with the same arrogant confidence that had once charmed me into marriage. His tall frame was wrapped in a custom-made suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly mortgage payments. The silver at his temples had grown more pronounced since I'd last seen him, adding to the distinguished air he cultivated so carefully. Behind him trailed his new wife, Victoria, her red-soled Louboutins clicking against the marble floor like a metronome counting down to their impending downfall. The familiar ache in my chest had long since been replaced by a cold, calculated resolve. I watched as they worked the room, Alexander's practiced smile never quite reaching his eyes as he greeted the city's real estate moguls, the same people who had once shunned me when the news of my bankruptcy had made the rounds in their circles. How quickly they had believed his carefully crafted story of my financial incompetence, never questioning how a successful investment banker could have been blindsided by her husband's elaborate scheme. I took a deliberate sip of champagne, allowing myself to savor the moment. The auction catalog in front of me listed 3 prime properties in Pacific Heights, all historically significant mansions that Alexander had openly coveted for years. Properties that, until recently, had been far beyond his reach. But his latest venture had finally put him in a position to bid on them. Or so he thought. The room continued to fill with potential buyers, their voices creating a symphony of power and privilege that I had once been part of. I recognized many faces. Timothy Walsh, the tech billionaire who had backed out of deals with Alexander twice, Sarah Kavanaugh, the real estate developer who had been my closest friend until the scandal broke, and James Morrison, the investment banker who had replaced me at the firm after Alexander's manipulations had destroyed my reputation. My fingers traced the edge of my phone, where an email from my private investigator waited to be read. 6 months of meticulous planning had led to this moment. Every property acquisition, every strategic investment, every carefully planted rumor in the real estate circles had been orchestrated for today. The same methodical attention to detail that had once made me one of the city's top investment bankers had been repurposed for something far more personal. A waiter passed by, offering fresh glasses of champagne. I declined with a subtle shake of my head, remembering the last time I had attended an event in this very room. It had been my final public appearance before everything crumbled, the night Alexander had introduced Victoria as his colleague, while our marriage was still intact. The night before I discovered the elaborate web of financial deception he had woven using my credentials, my reputation, and my trust. The memory no longer stung. Instead, it fueled the fire of satisfaction burning in my chest as I thought about the documents in my briefcase, papers proving my ownership of shell companies that had been systematically acquiring every property Alexander had shown interest in over the past year. Properties that would be revealed as part of the same holding company by the end of today's auction. The subtle shift in the room's energy signaled the approaching start of the auction. Alexander guided Victoria to a prime seat in the front row, his hand resting possessively on the small of her back, the same protective gesture he had once used with me. I watched as he leaned down to whisper something in her ear, probably promising her one of the Pacific Heights mansions as their future home. The same promise he had once made to me about other properties, before he orchestrated my financial ruin and left me to face the creditors alone. I moved to my assigned seat, deliberately chosen to be in Alexander's line of sight, but just far enough away to maintain the illusion of coincidence. The auctioneer approached the podium, his presence commanding immediate attention. As the room settled into anticipatory silence, I felt the weight of my past 18 months of careful planning converge into this single moment. The thick auction paddle felt solid in my hand. Number 49, a deliberate choice because it was the number of properties Alexander had attempted to acquire before I began systematically outbidding him through my network of shell companies. Soon, he would realize that every failed acquisition, every lost bid, every thwarted purchase had been orchestrated by the woman he had underestimated, the woman he had left bankrupt and alone, never suspecting she would rise from the ashes of his betrayal to become his most formidable opponent in the cutthroat world of luxury real estate. The auctioneer cleared his throat, and the last murmurs of conversation died away. I allowed myself a small smile as I opened my portfolio, ready for the performance of a lifetime. After today, Alexander Reynolds would learn that some debts can't be cleared through bankruptcy, and revenge, like prime real estate, is all about location, location, location. The familiar dance of power and privilege unfolded before me as I observed Alexander working the room with practiced ease. Each handshake, each carefully timed laugh, each strategic touch of his hand on someone's shoulder was choreographed with the precision of a man who had built his empire on the art of manipulation. I watched him move through the crowd of San Francisco's elite, remembering how I had once been mesmerized by that same calculated charm. Victoria floated in his wake, playing her role to perfection in a scarlet Valentino dress that probably cost more than what most people made in a month. Her diamond tennis bracelet caught the light with every gesture, a new addition to her collection that I recognized from the same jeweler who had once sized my engagement ring. The irony wasn't lost on me. Alexander had always been predictable. In his patterns, from his choice in jewelry to his selection of victims. From my strategically chosen position near the auction floor's eastern corner, I could observe without drawing attention. The old Sarah would have been obvious in her surveillance, but 18 months of careful planning had taught me the power of invisibility. I watched as Timothy Walsh approached Alexander, their handshake lasting a fraction too long, a detail that confirmed my private investigator's report about their recent private dealings. Despite the outward display of cordial business relationships, I knew the truth about the cracks beneath the surface of Alexander's carefully constructed facade. James Morrison, my former colleague, hovered at the edges of their conversation, his eager expression betraying his desperate need for Alexander's approval. The same expression I had seen in board meetings before Alexander had orchestrated my downfall. James had stepped into my position at the firm with suspicious convenience, never questioning how a woman with my track record could have suddenly committed such devastating financial miscalculations. Now, watching him laugh too loudly at Alexander's jokes, I could see the insecurity that made him such an easy pawn in our world of high-stakes real estate. The weight of my Mont Blanc pen felt reassuring as I made subtle notes in my portfolio, documenting each interaction, each whispered conversation. 18 months ago, I had learned the hard way that in this world, everything had to be documented. Every seemingly insignificant detail could become crucial ammunition. The same attention to detail that had once made me one of the top investment Bankers in the city now served a different purpose. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story, calculating not just financial returns, but the precise moment of maximum impact. Sarah Kavanaugh's entrance caused a subtle shift in the room's energy. Her reputation as a ruthless property developer preceded her, and even Alexander's confident smile flickered slightly as she approached his group. I remembered countless dinner parties at her Pacific Heights mansion, where she had once called me her closest friend. The same friend who had turned her back when the scandal broke, accepting Alexander's version of events without question. Now, watching her air kiss Victoria's cheeks, I could see the calculation behind her warmth. Sarah had always been skilled at aligning herself with power. The memory of my last conversation with Sarah surfaced unbidden. It had been 3 days after the news of my supposed financial misconduct had broken. "I'm sorry," she had said, her voice carrying the practiced sympathy of someone delivering a well-rehearsed line. "But I have to protect my reputation in this market." The same reputation she had built partly through the deals I had helped her secure during our friendship. The betrayal had stung then, but now it served as another reminder of why every step of my plan had to be flawless. A young server approached, my corner, offering fresh champagne. I declined with a subtle gesture, noting how his eyes lingered curiously on my face. No doubt he had been working here long enough to recognize the regular players in our world of luxury real estate, trying to place where he had seen me before. But the woman he was trying to remember, the one who had once commanded attention at these events, no longer existed. In her place sat someone far more dangerous, a woman who had learned to turn invisibility into power. Alexander's voice carried across the room as he launched into one of his favorite stories, the one about his first major property acquisition in Nob Hill. I had heard it countless times during our marriage, watching him embellish different details depending on his audience. Now, I caught the subtle inconsistencies in his telling, the carefully crafted lies designed to position him as the brilliant strategist who had seen potential where others saw risk. The truth, which only I knew, was far less flattering. That deal, like so many others, had been secured through carefully concealed manipulation and financial sleight of hand. Victoria laughed at all the right moments, her hand resting possessively on Alexander's arm. She wore the same expression I had once worn, a mix of adoration and pride that I now recognized as the look of someone who hadn't yet realized they were just another piece in his elaborate game. I wondered if she knew about the irregularities in his recent property acquisitions, or if, like me, she would only discover the truth when it was too late. The room had grown more crowded as the auction's start time approached, the air thick, with the scent of expensive perfumes and barely concealed ambition. I observed as more familiar faces arrived, Marcus Blackwood, the hedge fund manager who had been Alexander's tennis partner and confidant, Isabella Torres, the international hotel magnate who had once offered me a partnership before Alexander's machinations had destroyed my credibility, and Robert Freeman, the banking executive who had signed off on the documents that had sealed my financial ruin. Each of them had played their part in my downfall, whether knowingly or as unwitting pawns in Alexander's scheme. Now, watching them cluster in their usual social groups, I could see the invisible lines of power and influence that connected them all, the same connections I had spent the last 18 months mapping and manipulating, positioning myself through shell companies and proxy buyers to disrupt their carefully maintained order. A subtle vibration from my phone drew my attention. A message from my private investigator confirmed that everything was in place for the next phase of our plan. I allowed myself a moment to appreciate the symmetry of it all, how the same attention to detail that Alexander had used to orchestrate my bankruptcy would now be the instrument of his undoing. Every property he had lost to mysterious buyers over the past year, every deal that had inexplicably fallen through, had been carefully orchestrated to lead to this moment. The auctioneer's assistant began distributing the final registration papers, her heels clicking efficiently across the marble floor. I watched as Alexander received his documents, his confidence evident in the casual way he glanced over the details of the properties he thought would soon be his. The same confidence that had blinded him to the subtle signs of my reemergence in the market, preventing him from connecting the dots between his recent string of failed acquisitions and the woman he had underestimated. As the room settled into pre-auction anticipation, I felt the weight of my portfolio, filled with evidence of shell companies, proxy buyers, and carefully timed acquisitions, press against my leg. Every document inside represented a strand in the web I had woven around Alexander's empire, each piece positioned to trigger a cascade of revelations that would expose not just his past manipulations, but the fundamental weakness in his carefully constructed world, his inability to imagine that the woman he had destroyed could rise again, smarter and more dangerous than before. The auction began with the subtle tap of the auctioneer's gavel, its sound rippling through the Four Seasons ballroom like a pebble disturbing still water. I felt my pulse quicken as Jeffrey Hammond, the renowned auctioneer known for handling San Francisco's most prestigious property sales, cleared his throat and adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses. The moment I had orchestrated for 18 months was finally beginning to unfold. "Ladies and gentlemen," Hammond's cultured voice carried across the hushed room, "welcome to today's exclusive real estate auction. We begin with lot number 1, 2847 Broadway Street, a historic Pacific Heights mansion featuring 7 bedrooms, 9 bathrooms, and unobstructed views of the bay." His words were accompanied by stunning photographs appearing on the massive screens behind him, showcasing the property that I knew Alexander coveted most. I watched as Alexander leaned forward in his seat, his body language betraying his intense interest, despite his carefully maintained expression of casual indifference. Victoria's hand rested on his arm, her red lacquered nails digging slightly into his sleeve. A gesture of either support or possession, I couldn't quite tell. From my position, I could see the slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth, the same smile I had once mistaken for genuine warmth, but now recognized as his tell for anticipated victory. "We'll start the bidding at $28 million, Hammond announced, his gavel poised. "Do I hear 28 million? Alexander's paddle rose immediately, a confident gesture that drew knowing looks from those around him. His declaration of intent was met with murmurs of appreciation from the crowd. After all, this was exactly the type of bold move they expected from him. What they didn't know was that every aspect of this moment had been carefully choreographed, down to the exact property that would open the auction. $28 million from Mr. Reynolds, Hammond acknowledged. "Do I hear 29? A paddle rose from the back of the room, one of my proxy buyers, right on cue. $29 million from number 63. I watched as Alexander's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. This was the first deviation from his carefully laid plans, but certainly not the last. His paddle rose again without hesitation. 30 million. The next few minutes unfolded exactly as I had anticipated. The price climbed steadily as my proxy buyers executed their carefully orchestrated dance, pushing the bidding higher with each raise. Alexander's initially confident posture began to show subtle signs of strain. His shoulder muscles tensed beneath. His bespoke suit and the hand holding his paddle tightened until his knuckles whitened. At 38 million, well above the property's expected selling price, Alexander shot a questioning look at James Morrison, who gave him a slight nod. I knew from my intelligence that 38 million was precisely at the limit of what Alexander's latest financing could support. He had arranged the loans carefully, leveraging his existing properties and his firm's resources to ensure he could secure this mansion. What he didn't know was that I had already acquired controlling interests in 2 of the banks providing his financing. 40 million, called out another of my proxy buyers, causing a ripple of surprised whispers to spread through the crowd. The bid was astronomical, even by Pacific Heights standards. Alexander's pause was notable this time. I could see the calculations running behind his eyes as he weighed his options. His reputation demanded he continue bidding, but his financial constraints were beginning to bind. Victoria whispered something in his ear, her expression urgent. After a moment that seemed to stretch endlessly, his paddle rose again. 41 million. The next bid came instantly. 45 million. The room fell silent. Even Hammond seemed momentarily taken aback by the aggressive jump. Alexander's face remained composed, but I could see the slight tremor in his hand as he lowered his paddle. He turned to confer quietly with James Morrison, their heads bent together in urgent discussion. From my angle, I could see the sheen of sweat beginning to form on Morrison's forehead. 45 million for the first time. Hammond's voice cut through the tension. 45 million for the second time. Alexander's paddle stayed down. The gavel fell with a decisive crack. Sold to bidder number 63 for $45 million. The loss of the first property was just the beginning. As the auction proceeded to the second lot, another mansion Alexander had openly expressed interest in. The pattern repeated itself. My proxy buyers emerged at crucial moments, pushing the prices beyond his carefully arranged financing limits. With each lost bid, I watched the subtle shifts in his demeanor, the increasingly frequent loosening of his tie, the way his fingers drummed anxiously against his thigh, the growing tension in his jaw. By the time the third property slipped through, his grasp, the whispers in the room, had grown more pronounced. The invincible Alexander Reynolds was failing to secure any of his targeted properties, and in the ruthless world of luxury real estate, such a public display of weakness was blood in the water. I observed as Sarah Kavanaugh leaned over to whisper something to Timothy Walsh, both of them shooting speculative glances in Alexander's direction. The same people who had once abandoned me to protect their reputations were now beginning to question his. The irony was exquisite. The pivotal moment, the one I had planned for months, came during the auction of the fourth property. As Hammond announced the starting bid, my phone lit up with a text message. Right on schedule, an associate of mine, who worked at one of San Francisco's top financial newspapers, published an article questioning the stability of Alexander's recent real estate ventures. Within minutes, phones around the room began buzzing as the story spread through the city's elite social networks. I watched as Alexander reached for his own phone, his face draining of color as he read the notification. His eyes darted around the room, no doubt noting the way people were now openly staring at their screens and then at him. Victoria's perfectly maintained composure cracked slightly as she read over his shoulder, her hand flying to her throat in a gesture of distress. The article detailed a pattern of suspicious financial activities surrounding recent property acquisitions attempted by Alexander's company. It didn't explicitly accuse him of wrongdoing, but the implications were clear to anyone who understood the industry. More importantly, it hinted at upcoming revelations about the true ownership of several key properties he had failed to acquire over the past year. The whispers in the room grew louder, and I could see the exact moment Alexander realized his carefully constructed world was beginning to unravel. His eyes scanned the room frantically, no doubt searching for allies among the faces that had once smiled so readily at him. But in our world, allegiance followed power, and the first cracks in his facade were already showing. James Morrison had begun to edge away from Alexander's side, his survival instincts apparently overriding his loyalty. Sarah Kavanaugh was already engaged in intense conversation with her lawyer, no doubt trying to distance herself from any potential fallout. The same people who had once turned their backs on me were now beginning to turn away from him. It was then, in that moment of growing chaos, that Alexander's eyes finally found mine across the room. I held his gaze steadily, allowing myself a small, knowing smile, the kind he had once given me when he thought he had won. Recognition dawned in his eyes, followed quickly by disbelief, and then, most satisfyingly, fear. After 18 months of careful planning, watching him finally understand that his downfall had been orchestrated by the woman he had underestimated was better than any revenge I could have imagined. The auctioneer's voice continued in the background, but the room's attention had shifted. The carefully maintained veneer of civilized business had cracked, revealing the brutal reality of power and consequence that lay beneath. As Alexander's world began to crumble in real time, I remained perfectly still in my seat, a silent witness to the destruction I had orchestrated. The disruption I had planned was complete, but this was only the beginning of his fall from grace. As chaos erupted in the auction room, my mind drifted back to the precise moment, exactly 1 year ago, when my transformation from victim to victor had begun. I remembered standing in the rain outside a small cafe in Hong Kong's Central District, my hand trembling slightly as I read an email that would change everything. The message was from Li Wei Zhang, my former client from my investment banking, days, and contained just 4 words: "I believe in you still." Those words had been my lifeline, arriving exactly when I had hit rock bottom. I had fled to Hong Kong after the bankruptcy, using the last of my savings and the only asset Alexander hadn't managed to touch, a small inheritance from my grandmother that he hadn't known about. While he assumed I was broken and hiding in shame, I was actually laying the groundwork for the most elaborate property acquisition strategy San Francisco had ever seen. Li Wei hadn't just offered belief, he had offered resources. As one of Asia's most successful real estate moguls, he remembered how I had helped him navigate the complex waters of American property investment years ago. More importantly, he had never believed the stories of my supposed financial incompetence. "A woman who quadrupled my portfolio in 2 years doesn't make amateur mistakes," he had said during our first meeting in his gleaming office overlooking Victoria Harbor. That meeting had lasted 6 hours, during which I had laid out my suspicions about Alexander's methods and my plan for exposing them. Li Wei had listened intently, asking occasional sharp questions that helped refine my strategy. By the end of the night, he had not only agreed to become my silent partner, but had also introduced me to his network of discreet international investors who operated through complex networks of shell companies. The next 3 months had been intense, spent between Hong Kong, Singapore, and Dubai, building a web of financial entities so intricate that even the best forensic accountants would struggle to connect them to me. Each company was legitimate, each transaction meticulously documented, but the ownership structures were deliberately obscured through multiple layers of international corporations. I had learned from Alexander's methods, but unlike him, I ensured everything I did was technically legal, just extraordinarily complex. My first move had been to acquire a small property management firm in Delaware, which then purchased a controlling interest in a Singapore-based investment company, which owned shares in multiple real estate holding companies across 3 continents. This labyrinthine structure allowed me to begin acquiring properties without raising suspicions. Each purchase was made through a different subsidiary, each transaction handled by different law firms, each deal structured uniquely to avoid revealing any patterns. I remembered the first property I had taken from Alexander's grasp, a boutique hotel in Nob Hill that he had been negotiating to purchase for months. Through my network of sources, I had learned exactly how much he was planning to offer, and had swooped in 24 hours before his scheduled closing with an all-cash offer that the sellers couldn't refuse. The property had gone to one of my shell companies, registered in the Cayman Islands and operating through a Swiss bank account. The look on his face when that deal had fallen through had been my first taste of satisfaction, though he had no idea I was behind it. That success had emboldened me, and over the next several months I had systematically targeted every property he showed interest in. Each acquisition was carefully timed to appear random, each purchase made through a different entity, each transaction designed to slowly drain his resources, as he was forced to repeatedly engage in bidding wars he couldn't win. Li Wei's training had been invaluable during this period. He had taught me the art of patience in property warfare, showing me how to use time and market psychology as weapons. "Real estate isn't just about buildings," he had said. "It's about understanding human nature. The strongest position is the one your opponent doesn't know you hold. Following his advice, I had hired a team of private investigators to track Alexander's every move in the real estate market. Every lunch meeting, every property viewing, every casual expression of interest in a building was noted and analyzed. I built a comprehensive map of his intended acquisitions, always staying 2 steps ahead of his plans. The most satisfying part had been watching him gradually deplete his financial resources, trying to secure properties that kept slipping through his fingers. Each failed acquisition forced him to take on more debt, leverage more assets, make riskier financial moves. I knew his patterns. He would never back down from a property he wanted. His ego wouldn't allow it. It was this predictability that I had used against him, leading him into a carefully laid trap of his own making. My team of financial analysts, all hired through separate consulting firms to maintain discretion, had tracked every loan, every leverage point, every financial manipulation he employed. I watched as he gradually used up his credit lines, stretched his resources thin, and began taking increasingly desperate measures to maintain his appearance of success. The true masterstroke had been acquiring controlling interests in 2 of the regional banks he relied on for financing. This had been done through a series of minority shareholding purchases by different offshore companies, each seeming unrelated, but all ultimately controlled by my primary holding company. It had taken 6 months and nearly half of my available capital, but it gave me the power to monitor his financial movements from the inside and, when the time was right, begin subtly restricting his access to credit. As these memories flowed through my mind, I watched Alexander across the auction room, knowing that he was just beginning to understand the extent of his predicament. The properties he had lost today were just the visible part of the iceberg. Within the next 24 hours, he would discover that most of the properties he had failed to acquire over the past year were actually controlled by a single entity, my primary holding company, soon to be revealed as one of the largest property owners in San Francisco. The dossier in my briefcase contained proof of every transaction, every shell company, every strategic move I had made. More importantly, it contained evidence of how I had used entirely legal means to accomplish what he had done through fraud and manipulation. Every document was ready to be released to the press, showing how a woman he had underestimated had outmaneuvered him at his own game. My phone buzzed quietly, another message from Li Wei. "All final transfers complete. Checkmate," I allowed. Myself a small smile, knowing that at this exact moment, the ownership of several key properties was being transferred to my primary holding company, consolidating my position as one of the city's most significant property owners. The timing was precise, designed to coincide with the moment Alexander would be most vulnerable. Looking around the room at the whispered conversations and concerned glances, I knew that San Francisco's real estate elite were about to discover that the woman they had shunned 18 months ago had risen from the ashes of bankruptcy to become their most powerful colleague. Every person who had turned their back on me would soon realize they had backed the wrong player in this high-stakes game. The satisfaction I felt wasn't just about revenge. It was about justice served through the very system Alexander had tried to use against me. While he had relied on fraud and manipulation, I had built my resurrection on meticulous planning and legitimate business strategies. His fall would come not from broken laws, but from being outmaneuvered by the woman he had thought too weak to fight back. The auction room had transformed into a battlefield of whispers and hastily made phone calls. The growing realization of Alexander's successive failures rippled through the crowd like shockwaves after an earthquake. But I remained perfectly still in my seat, a calm eye in the center of the storm I had created. Each ping of a notification on the gathered phones, each hurried conversation, each worried glance was another piece of my victory falling perfectly into place. I watched as Alexander's carefully constructed world began to fracture around him. His phone hadn't stopped buzzing since the article broke. No doubt his lawyers, investors, and partners all demanding explanations. Victoria had excused herself 10 minutes ago, her Louboutins clicking a hurried retreat toward the ladies' room. But not before I caught the look of barely concealed panic in her eyes. The same look I had worn 18 months ago when my own world had imploded. James Morrison was now openly avoiding Alexander's attempts to catch his eye, suddenly deeply engaged in a conversation with two real estate developers near the bar. I could read the calculation in his stance. The same survival instinct that had led him to distance himself from me during my downfall was now prompting him to abandon Alexander. In our world, loyalty lasted only as long as power did. Sarah Kavanaugh had positioned herself strategically near the exit, her phone pressed to her ear as she spoke in urgent whispers. Even from across the room, I could read her lips forming. The words, damage control and distance ourselves. The irony wasn't lost on me. She had used the same phrases when cutting ties with me, always the first to abandon a sinking ship. A subtle movement caught my eye as Timothy Walsh slipped out of the ballroom, no doubt heading to his office to reassess his recent deals with Alexander. I knew from my intelligence that they had 3 major development projects in the pipeline, all of which would now be scrutinized in light of today's events. The house of cards was falling exactly as I had planned, each reaction triggering another in a perfectly choreographed dance of destruction. My phone vibrated with a message from Li Wei. Second phase initiated, all documents being released to major financial publications in next 30 minutes. I allowed myself a small sip of water, feeling the cool liquid contrast with the warm satisfaction spreading through my chest. The article that had shaken the room was just the opening salvo. The real bombshells were yet to come. Alexander was now standing near the podium, engaged in what appeared to be a heated discussion with his primary lawyer, Michael Davidson. I could see the tension in Alexander's shoulders, the way his left hand kept adjusting his tie, a nervous tic I remembered from our marriage, one that only appeared when he felt truly threatened. Davidson's usually composed face showed signs of strain as he scrolled through something on his tablet, likely reviewing the mounting evidence of their precarious position. The auctioneer had called for a brief intermission, a standard practice, between major lot offerings, but the timing couldn't have been more perfect for my purposes. It gave the news time to spread, allowed the whispers to grow louder, and most importantly, gave everyone in the room time to process the implications of what they were witnessing. I felt a presence beside me and turned to find Isabella Torres, the hotel magnate, sliding gracefully into the empty seat next to mine. Her expression was carefully neutral, but I could see the keen interest in her dark eyes. "Quite an interesting morning," she murmured, her accent adding a musical quality to the understatement. I merely nodded, maintaining my composure. Isabella had been one of the few who had privately expressed doubts about Alexander's version of my downfall, though she had remained publicly neutral. "One might wonder," she continued softly, "if there is more to this story than meets the eye." Her gaze was penetrating, and I knew she was putting the pieces together faster than most. Isabella hadn't built her international hotel empire by being slow to recognize shifts in power. I met her gaze steadily, allowing a hint of a smile to play at the corners of my mouth. "The real estate market is full of surprises," I replied, my voice carrying just enough weight to confirm her suspicions without saying anything explicit. Her eyes widened slightly, and I saw the moment of recognition, the realization that she was sitting next to the architect of Alexander's downfall. Across the room, I noticed Robert Freeman, the banking executive who had signed off on my financial ruin, hurriedly gathering his things. His face had lost its usual ruddy color, replaced by a sickly pallor that suggested he understood the implications of what was unfolding. He had rubber-stamped Alexander's manipulated documents without proper due diligence, and now that decision was coming back to haunt him. A fresh wave of murmurs swept through the room as more phones lit up with notifications. The second wave of revelations was beginning right on schedule. I watched as people's expressions changed while reading the new information. The detailed exposé of how a mysterious holding company had systematically acquired prime San Francisco properties over the past year, all properties that Alexander had publicly expressed interest in. The article didn't name me directly, but it laid out a pattern that would be impossible to ignore for anyone familiar with the players involved. More importantly, it raised questions about the financial stability of Alexander's recent ventures, hinting at the over-leveraged positions and desperate maneuvers he had employed in his failed attempts to secure properties. Victoria had returned to Alexander's side, but her body language had shifted subtly. She stood slightly apart from him now, her perfectly manicured hands clutching her phone like a lifeline. I recognized the look in her eyes, the same one I had worn when I first began to suspect that my husband wasn't the man I thought he was. The seeds of doubt had been planted, and I knew from experience they would grow rapidly in the fertile soil of suspicion. A movement near the entrance caught my attention as Marcus Blackwood entered the room, his face grave. As Alexander's tennis partner and confidant, he would have just received the news about the third article, the one detailing the web of shell companies and their connections to specific properties. I watched as he made his way directly to Alexander, ignoring the attempts of others to catch his attention. The message he delivered caused Alexander's face to drain of what little color remained. The satisfaction I felt wasn't just about revenge. It was about justice served through the very system Alexander had tried to use against me. While he had relied on fraud and manipulation, I had built my resurrection on meticulous planning and legitimate business strategies. His fall would come not from broken laws, but from being outmaneuvered by the woman he had thought too weak to fight back. I could feel the weight of the moment settling around me, the culmination of 18 months of careful planning crystallizing into this perfect instance of revelation. The room continued to buzz with speculation and concern, but I remained still, allowing the chaos to swirl around me while maintaining my position of calculated observation. Each reaction, each hurried exit, each whispered conversation was another note in the symphony of Alexander's downfall, a composition I had orchestrated with painstaking precision. The next wave of revelations would be even more devastating, timed to coincide with the resumption of the auction. As I watched Alexander's world crumble piece by piece, I felt not just the satisfaction of revenge, but the deep, resonant pleasure of knowing that I had beaten him at his own game, using the very tools and methods he had thought himself master. The intermission was drawing to a close, and Jeffrey Hammond was making his way back to the podium. The room had shifted from its earlier atmosphere of refined competition to one charged with tension and uncertainty. The moment had come for my final move, the one that would transform me from a silent observer to the undisputed power player in San Francisco's real estate world. I rose from my seat with deliberate grace, feeling the weight of my Chanel blazer against my shoulders like armor. The portfolio in my hand contained documents that would shatter the last remnants of Alexander's carefully constructed facade. Each step I took toward the podium echoed against the marble floor, drawing attention from the scattered group still engaged in urgent whispered conversations. "Mr. Hammond," I called out, my voice carrying clearly across the room. "I believe it's time for an important announcement regarding today's proceedings." The auctioneer paused, his experience with high-stakes auctions evident in the way he quickly assessed the situation and gave me a professional nod. Alexander's head snapped up at the sound of my voice, his eyes widening with a mixture of recognition and dawning horror. The room fell silent as I made my way to the front, the click of my heels against marble the only sound in the suddenly still air. Victoria's hand froze halfway to her mouth, her perfectly applied lipstick slightly smudged from nervous biting. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, my voice steady and confident, "I think it's time we bring some clarity to today's events." I opened my portfolio and removed a sleek tablet, activating it to project onto the screens behind the podium. My name, as some of you may remember, is Catherine Morrison Reynolds, though I've recently returned to my maiden name, Catherine Morrison. The whispers started immediately, but I continued, my voice cutting through them with practiced authority. Over the past year, through my holding company, Morrison Global Ventures, I have acquired controlling interests in several significant properties in the San Francisco Bay Area. With a swipe of my finger, a map appeared on the screens, showing dozens of properties highlighted in red, every single one a building Alexander had tried to purchase. These acquisitions, all conducted through legitimate and fully documented transactions, represent a total investment of over $2 billion in prime San Francisco real estate. Another swipe brought up a complex chart of corporate structures. Each property was acquired through various subsidiary companies, all ultimately controlled by Morrison Global Ventures. I could see Alexander's lawyer, Davidson, frantically typing on his phone, no doubt trying to verify the information I was presenting. Sarah Kavanaugh had moved closer, her earlier attempt to distance herself forgotten in the face of this dramatic revelation. James Morrison had gone pale, likely realizing that his quick abandonment of me 18 months ago had been a catastrophic miscalculation. Today's auction has made it clear that certain parties, I allowed my gaze to rest briefly on Alexander, have been operating under the misconception that they could continue their pattern of aggressive acquisition without consequence. I paused, letting the weight of my words sink in. That ends today. With another tap on my tablet, new information filled the screens. Detailed financial records showing how Alexander's recent property ventures had been built on increasingly shaky financial foundations. As the new controlling shareholder in both Pacific West Bank and Bay Area Credit Union, I feel it's my duty to inform this gathering that all outstanding loans and credit lines will be undergoing immediate review for compliance. The impact was immediate. Alexander lurched to his feet, his face contorted with a mixture of rage and disbelief. "You can't," he began, but I cut him off smoothly. "I can, and I have," I stated, my voice carrying an edge of steel. "Every transaction, every shell company, every property acquisition has been meticulously documented and verified by 3 independent audit firms." I gestured to my tablet where the logos of prestigious accounting firms now appeared. Unlike some, I believe in maintaining impeccable records. The room erupted in controlled chaos. Phones were frantically accessed. Whispered conversations grew more urgent, and I could see various power players in the room rapidly reassessing their allegiances. Victoria had physically distanced herself from Alexander. Her earlier show of unity completely evaporated. "Furthermore," I continued, my voice cutting through the chaos, "I'm announcing the formation of the Morrison Real Estate Trust, which will be acquiring additional properties throughout the Bay Area." I allowed myself a small smile. "We're particularly interested in properties that have been, let's say, mismanaged by their current ownership." The implication was clear to everyone in the room. I was not just revealing my power. I was declaring war on Alexander's entire real estate empire. The screens behind me now showed a series of properties currently owned by his company, each one flagged with potential irregularities in their financing. "For those interested in discussing potential partnerships or property transitions," I added, pulling a business card from my portfolio and holding it up, "my office will be accepting meetings starting tomorrow morning. I suspect some of you may find it beneficial to secure appointments sooner rather than later." The reaction was immediate. Several people reached for their phones, no doubt instructing their assistants to book appointments. Isabella Torres caught my eye from across the room and gave me a subtle nod of approval. She recognized a power play when she saw one. "Mr. Hammond." I turned to the auctioneer, who had been watching the proceedings with professional composure. "I believe we can now resume the auction, though I suspect some bidders may wish to reassess their positions given this new information." As I stepped away from the podium, I felt the shift in the room's energy. The whispers had taken on a different tone, no longer shocked or scandalized, but calculating and eager. In our world, power was everything, and I had just demonstrated that I now held more of it than anyone else in the room. I walked back to my seat, my path now cleared by people eager to make eye contact and offer subtle nods of acknowledgement. The same people who had shunned me 18 months ago were now desperately trying to position themselves as potential allies. Alexander remained standing, his face a mask of barely contained fury and desperation. His eyes followed me across the room, and I could see him struggling to process how completely I had outmaneuvered him. The man who had once dismissed me as financially naive was now watching his empire crumble under the weight of my strategic brilliance. As I settled back into my seat, I felt the satisfying weight of the moment. This wasn't just revenge, it was a complete reversal of power, executed with the same precision and attention to detail that had once made me one of the city's top investment bankers. I had not just reclaimed my position, I had transcended it, becoming something far more powerful than Alexander had ever imagined I could be. The auction room had transformed into a theater of shifting allegiances, with every glance, movement, and whispered conversation carrying the weight of calculated repositioning. As I sat in my carefully chosen seat, I watched the aftermath of my announcement ripple through San Francisco's real estate elite like waves on a disturbed pond, each circle of impact more revealing than the last. Alexander remained rooted to his spot, his usual commanding presence diminished by the shock of my revelation. His phone buzzed incessantly, no doubt calls from partners, investors, and creditors all demanding immediate explanations. I observed as he checked the screen, his face growing increasingly ashen with each notification. The man who had once wielded his phone like a scepter, destroying careers and fortunes with a single call, now stared at it as if it were a live grenade. Victoria's transformation was perhaps the most telling. The woman who had smugly taken my place, both in Alexander's life and in our social circles, now stood slightly apart from him, her body language screaming disconnection. She was already crafting her exit strategy. I could see it in the way she clutched her designer handbag, in how her eyes darted between the room's power players, assessing potential lifelines. The irony wasn't lost on me. She was already planning her escape from the same trap that had once ensnared me. James Morrison's reaction particularly caught my attention. My former colleague had positioned himself strategically near the bar, his tie slightly loosened, a telling detail for a man who prided himself on impeccable presentation. He was speaking rapidly into his phone, his free hand gesturing in the agitated manner I remembered from our days closing difficult deals. Through my network of sources, I knew exactly who he was calling, his contact at Goldman Sachs, desperately trying to salvage his reputation before the fallout destroyed his carefully cultivated career prospects. Sarah Kavanaugh proved true to her nature, demonstrating why she had survived multiple market crashes and industry upheavals. Within minutes of my announcement, she had orchestrated a subtle but clear separation from Alexander's inner circle, positioning herself closer to my side of the room. Her networking skills were legendary, and I watched with quiet amusement as she worked the crowd, her whispered conversations no doubt rewriting history to minimize her previous alliance with Alexander. The transformation of Timothy Walsh was equally fascinating. The tech billionaire who had backed several of Alexander's recent ventures now stood near the emergency exit, his usual confident demeanor replaced by barely concealed panic. His fingers flew over his phone's keyboard, likely instructing his team of lawyers to find any possible way to disentangle his investments from Alexander's crumbling empire. I knew from my research that their partnerships went deep, each questionable deal now a potential liability. Isabella Torres, ever the shrewd businesswoman, had already begun making her move. She caught my eye across the room and raised her glass, in a subtle salute, her expression conveying both congratulations and an offer of future alliance. Of all the people in the room, she alone had maintained her composure, recognizing my revelation not as a catastrophe, but as an opportunity for strategic realignment. The auction staff huddled near the podium, uncertainty clear in their body language. Jeffrey Hammond, despite his years of experience handling high-stakes auctions, seemed unsure whether to proceed with the remaining lots. The upcoming properties now carried different implications, each one a potential piece in the larger game of power and influence that I had just redefined. Robert Freeman, the banking executive, had turned an interesting shade of gray. His position at Pacific West Bank would be among the first casualties of my takeover. The due diligence reports I had ordered were already being processed, each one designed to expose the corners he had cut and the oversights he had committed, in service to Alexander's schemes. His career, built on quiet compliance with powerful men's demands, was about to become a cautionary tale in regulatory circles. Marcus Blackwood, Alexander's longtime confidant, demonstrated remarkable survival instincts. He had already edged away from his former friend and was engaged in what appeared to be an intense conversation with his lawyer. The tennis games and private club meetings that had cemented their friendship now seemed like relics of a bygone era, replaced by the harsh reality of potential legal exposure. The younger real estate developers in the room, those who had once looked up to Alexander as a mentor and model of success, now huddled in small groups, their expressions a mixture of shock and calculation. They were witnessing not just the fall of a powerful man, but the reshaping of the very power structure they had hoped to climb. The lessons they took from this day would likely influence their careers for years to come. I noticed Michael Davidson, Alexander's lawyer, methodically packing his briefcase, his movements precise and controlled despite the chaos around him. As one of San Francisco's top real estate attorneys, he understood better than most the implications of what had just unfolded. The slight tremor in his hands as he sorted through his documents suggested he was already preparing for the inevitable legal battles ahead. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see several people who had slipped out to the hotel's courtyard, engaged in urgent phone calls. Their gestures and expressions told a story of damage control and rapid repositioning. News of my takeover would be rippling through San Francisco's business community, causing tremors in boardrooms and executive suites across the city. Even the hotel staff had picked up on the shift in power dynamics. The servers, who had been circulating with drinks and canapes, now oriented their movements toward my section of the room, unconsciously acknowledging the new center of gravity in the space. It was a subtle detail, but one that spoke volumes about how quickly power structures adjust to new realities. Victoria made a show of checking her watch, her movements deliberately casual but betraying an underlying urgency. I recognized the look in her eyes, the same one I had worn when I first began to understand the true nature of Alexander's character. She was calculating her options, weighing the costs of loyalty against the benefits of self-preservation. The diamond tennis bracelet on her wrist, so similar to the one Alexander had given me during our marriage, caught the light as she moved, a glittering reminder of how history repeats itself. The room had become a living tableau of cause and effect, each person's reaction triggering responses in others, creating a complex web of shifting relationships and allegiances. The carefully maintained facade of civilized business had cracked, revealing the raw dynamics of power and survival that had always lurked beneath the surface of our polished world. The remainder of the auction proceeded like a carefully orchestrated symphony of destruction, each lot another nail in the coffin of Alexander's empire. As the final gavel fell, I gathered my belongings with deliberate precision, every movement a statement of controlled power. The time had come for the physical demonstration of my victory, a series of carefully planned moves that would cement my transformation from victim to victor in the eyes of San Francisco's real estate elite. I stood, smoothing my Chanel blazer with the same attention to detail that had characterized my 18-month journey of revenge. My Hermes briefcase, a recent acquisition that replaced the one Alexander had given me during our marriage, felt solid in my hand, weighted with documents that would reshape the city's real estate landscape. The room's attention followed my movement as I made my way toward the exit, my path deliberately taking me past Alexander's position. He still stood there, his earlier confidence shattered, looking somehow diminished in his bespoke suit. As I approached, he made a move as if to speak, but I cut him off with a single raised hand, the same dismissive gesture he had once used on me during board meetings. "Your office will be hearing from Morrison Global Ventures' legal team within the hour," I stated, my voice carrying just far enough to reach the nearest clusters of interested observers. "I suggest you clear your schedule for the next few days." The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone in the room. The student had become the master, the victim now the victor. I continued past him without waiting for a response, the click of my heels against marble creating a rhythm that seemed to echo the beating of my triumphant heart. Victoria had already disappeared, no doubt making calls to secure her own position in the aftermath of the day's events. Outside the Four Seasons, my driver held the door of a sleek black Maybach, a car chosen specifically because it was the model Alexander had always coveted but never quite managed to acquire. As I settled into the leather interior, I pulled out my phone and initiated the next phase of my plan. "Start the sequence," I instructed my chief of operations, knowing that across the city, teams of lawyers and executives were now moving to secure my victory. The car glided through San Francisco's streets, passing buildings that now belonged to my empire. Each property we passed told a story of careful planning and strategic acquisition. We turned onto California Street, where the headquarters of Pacific West Bank stood as a testament to my most ambitious move, the takeover of one of Alexander's primary lenders. The building's glass facade reflected the late afternoon sun, its windows witnessing the shift in power that was now sending shockwaves through the city's financial district. "Take me to the Millennium Tower," I instructed my driver. The luxury high-rise had been Alexander's pride and joy, the penthouse his symbol of success. But now, through a series of complex financial maneuvers, the building's management company was under my control. As we pulled up to the entrance, I saw the security team snap to attention. They had already been briefed about the change in ownership. The private elevator rode smoothly to the top floor, where Alexander's personal office occupied prime real estate with panoramic views of the bay. I stepped into the space that had once been his sanctuary, noting the expensive artwork and custom furniture that would soon be replaced. My team was already there, led by Emma Chen, my newly appointed head of operations. "Everything is proceeding according to schedule," Emma reported, handing me a tablet displaying real-time updates of our takeover operations. "The banking review teams are in place, and we've already initiated audits of all suspicious transactions. Legal has filed the preliminary paperwork for the property transfers, and PR is managing the narrative with key media outlets." I moved to the floor-to-ceiling windows, taking in the view that Alexander had once used to intimidate visitors and business partners. The city spread out below, a maze of opportunities and power plays that I now controlled. My reflection in the glass showed a woman transformed, no longer the naive investment banker who had trusted her husband, but a force to be reckoned with in her own right. "Start the renovations immediately," I instructed, turning back to Emma. "I want every trace of the previous management erased by the end of the week. The new board will need appropriate accommodations for our first meeting." The symbolism of claiming his personal space, of transforming it into the headquarters of my own empire, was a message that would resonate throughout San Francisco's business community. My phone buzzed with updates from various team members, law firms confirming the filing of multiple suits against Alexander's companies, banks initiating reviews of his accounts, and property management firms transferring control to my organizations. Each notification was another strand in the web I had woven, another step in the complete dismantling of his world. The sun was setting over the bay, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reflected off the surrounding buildings. Watched as lights began to flicker on across the city, each one a potential piece in my expanding empire. The weight of the moment settled around me. This was more than just revenge. It was a complete restructuring of power in San Francisco's real estate world. Emma approached with another tablet, this one displaying live feeds from security cameras in the building's lobby. I watched as Alexander's personal items were being removed from his private elevator entrance, his dedicated parking space already reassigned, his security access revoked. The physical erasure of his presence was happening in real time. Each removal a symbolic step in claiming this space as my own. The contractors are ready to begin the renovations, Emma reported. We've already selected new artwork, furniture, and design elements that align with Morrison Global Ventures' aesthetic. The plans she pulled up showed a complete transformation of the space. Gone would be the dark woods and masculine energy that Alexander had favored, replaced by a modern, sophisticated design that reflected my vision for the future. I moved to his former desk, an oversized monstrosity of rare wood and brass fixtures, and ran my finger along its surface. Have this donated to the Historical Society, I instructed, along with the rest of his furniture. Everything here needs to be replaced. The symbolism of donating his prized possessions to a museum was not subtle. His era was now officially history. The elevator dinged, and my security team entered with the building's former head of operations. He looked nervous, his tie slightly askew as he carried a box containing master keys, security codes, and access cards. "Mrs. Morrison," he began, but I corrected him immediately. "Ms. Morrison," I stated firmly. "And yes, I'll need everything transferred immediately. My team will handle the security protocols from here." The man nodded quickly, understanding that his position, like everything else in this building, was now under review. As the sun disappeared below the horizon, I stood in what was now my office, feeling the weight of my victory settle around me. The physical taking of this space, this symbol of power in San Francisco's real estate world, was the clearest message I could send to everyone who had once doubted me. Each change, each renovation, each removal of Alexander's influence was another step in establishing my new reality. I picked up my phone one final time for the day, dialing a number I had long memorized but never used. Alexander's private line rang 3 times before going to voicemail. "The locks have been changed," I said simply, before ending the call. In our world of property and power, some messages needed no elaboration. The week following my takeover unfolded like a masterfully choreographed performance, each day bringing new developments that further cemented my position as San Francisco's most powerful real estate figure. I had moved my base of operations to the penthouse office in the Millennium Tower, now transformed into a command center from which I orchestrated the systematic dismantling of Alexander's remaining influence. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across my new desk. A sleek, modern piece crafted from glass and steel that perfectly embodied the transparency I was bringing to an industry long plagued by backroom deals and hidden agendas. Before me lay the morning's reports, detailed analyses of property acquisitions, bank records, and market positions that painted a picture of my growing empire. Emma entered with her usual efficiency, tablet in hand and ready for our morning briefing. "The audit teams have completed their preliminary review of Pacific West Bank's loan portfolio," she began, pulling up detailed spreadsheets. "They've identified 37 instances of questionable lending practices, all connected to Alexander's various ventures." The numbers told a story of systematic manipulation, one that would now serve as evidence in the multiple investigations being launched. I sipped my morning espresso, served in a delicate cup from the same Hermes collection that Victoria had once bragged about at charity functions. "How are the property transitions progressing?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. In our world, asking was often more about sending a message than seeking information. "Smoothly," Emma replied. "We've completed the management change in 15 of the major properties. The remaining 7 will be transitioned by the end of the week." She paused, a slight smile playing at her lips. "The Peninsula Hotel Group has already reached out about potential partnership opportunities. Apparently, they're eager to distance themselves from their previous agreements with Alexander." The mention of the Peninsula Group brought a particular satisfaction. They had been one of the first to shun me during my supposed downfall. Now they were practically begging for a meeting. I made a mental note to let them wait another week before having my office respond. My phone buzzed with a message from Li Wei in Hong Kong. The time difference meant he was already ahead of us, dealing with the Asian market's reaction to my power play. Our partners in Singapore are quite impressed, his message read. They're interested in expanding our collaboration to include properties in the Asian market. Another door opening, another opportunity arising from the ashes of my previous life. The intercom buzzed and my assistant's voice came through. Ms. Morrison, Sarah Kavanaugh is here for her 9 o'clock. Right on time. Sarah had been among the first to reach out after my revelation at the auction, eager to realign herself with the new power structure. I took a moment to adjust my position, ensuring the morning light fell just right, creating the imposing silhouette I had carefully cultivated. Send her in, I instructed, noting how different this felt from our previous interactions, when she had been the one wielding power and influence. Sarah entered with her usual grace, but I could see the nervous energy beneath her polished exterior. Her Prada handbag, last season's model, I noted, clutched slightly too tightly, her smile a touch too eager. Catherine, she began, using my first name as if we were still the close friends we'd once been. Thank you for seeing me, I gestured. To the chair across from my desk, its slightly lower height another subtle reminder of our new dynamic. I assume you're here to discuss the Marina District Development Project, I stated, rather than asked. The project had been one of her prime investments, one that Alexander had helped finance through now questionable means. Yes, well, she shifted slightly in her seat. I was hoping we could discuss a potential restructuring of the ownership arrangement. Given the recent changes, she trailed off, letting the implications hang in the air. I opened a folder on my tablet, displaying detailed analysis of the project's financing. Our audit shows some interesting patterns in the initial funding, I noted, watching her composure flicker slightly. Perhaps we should start there. The meeting continued for exactly 30 minutes, during which I laid out my terms for allowing her to maintain a stake in the project. Each condition was a carefully crafted reminder of our new positions. Her role would be minimal, her profits capped, and her decisions subject to my approval. The woman who had once dismissed me from her social circle was now practically grateful for the chance to be a minor player in my world. As Sarah left, visibly relieved to have salvaged something from the wreckage of her alliance with Alexander, Emma returned with updates from our legal team. The regulatory agencies have officially launched their investigation into Alexander's banking practices, she reported. They're particularly interested in the documentation we provided regarding the Pacific Heights property deals. I moved to the window, looking out over the city that was rapidly becoming my domain. Below, construction crews were already at work on one of my newest acquisitions, a prime piece of real estate that Alexander had tried to secure for years. The sound of their machinery drifted up, a symphony of progress and change. What's the status of the Nob Hill conversion project? I asked, though the detailed reports were already in my morning briefing. The project, converting a historic hotel into luxury condominiums, had been Alexander's dream for years. Now it would be completed under my direction, with every detail reflecting my vision rather than his. Emma pulled up the relevant files. The architectural plans have been revised according to your specifications. The Historical Society has approved our modifications, and the contractors are ready to begin next week. She paused, then added, the penthouse unit that Victoria had been designing for herself has been completely reimagined. The new plans incorporate your suggestions for a community wellness center instead. The irony of transforming what would have been Victoria's dream home into a public space was not lost on either of us. In our world, such gestures carried weight far beyond their practical implications. My phone buzzed again. this time with news from our banking division. The review of Alexander's accounts had uncovered exactly what I had expected: a pattern of leveraged positions and risky investments that would now be his undoing. Each discovery was another thread pulled from the tapestry of his former life, another piece of evidence that would ensure his fall from grace was permanent. Schedule. The board meeting for tomorrow, I instructed Emma. It's time to implement phase 2 of our expansion plan. The meeting would bring together the heads of all my newly acquired properties and companies, many of them former allies of Alexander, who had quickly pledged their loyalty to the new power structure I represented. As the day progressed, I received regular updates from various teams, property management transitions proceeding smoothly, banking reviews uncovering more evidence of questionable practices, legal preparations advancing for multiple civil suits. Each report was another brick in the foundation of my new empire, built not on the quicksand of manipulation and fraud, but on the solid ground of strategic thinking and legitimate business practices. 1 month after the auction that had changed everything, I stood in my private office as the sun set over San Francisco Bay, casting a golden glow across the city I now effectively controlled. The woman reflected in the floor-to-ceiling windows barely resembled the one who had fled in shame 18 months ago. The physical similarities were there, the same height, the same features, but everything else had transformed. My phone buzzed with another update from the financial teams handling the dismantling of Alexander's empire. Each notification represented another piece of his world crumbling, another asset being redistributed, another partner abandoning ship. But these updates no longer brought the sharp satisfaction they once had. Something deeper had taken root in place of that need for revenge, a profound understanding of my own power that transcended any desire to simply destroy what he had built. Emma entered with the evening briefing, her presence a reminder of how far I'd come from the days when I worked alone, driven by nothing but the need for vengeance. The last of the property transfers has been completed, she reported, setting a leather portfolio on my desk. Morrison Global Ventures now officially controls 68% of premium real estate in the financial district. I nodded, remembering a time when such news would have filled me with vindictive pleasure. Now it felt more like confirmation of something I already knew, that I had not just survived Alexander's betrayal, but had transcended it entirely. What's the status of the Community Development Initiative? I asked, turning my attention to the project that had increasingly occupied my thoughts. Emma pulled up the relevant documents on her tablet. The conversion of the Pacific Heights property into affordable housing units is proceeding ahead of schedule. The local council was particularly impressed with the inclusion of the educational center and job training facilities. This project, transforming what would have been another luxury development into something that could actually benefit the community, represented everything I had learned about the true nature of power. It wasn't just about acquisition and control. It was about the ability to effect meaningful change. I moved to my desk, running my fingers along its smooth surface. The modern glass and steel construction had replaced Alexander's heavy wooden monstrosity, just as my transparent business practices had replaced his web of secret deals and hidden agendas. Schedule a meeting with the educational consultants. For next week, I instructed. I want to be directly involved in developing the training programs. The irony wasn't lost on me, that my quest for revenge had led me to discover a purpose far more meaningful than mere retribution. Each decision I now made carried the weight of responsibility to something larger than my own vindication. My phone lit up with a message from Li Wei. Saw the announcement about the community development project. This is why I believed in you from the start. His words triggered memories of that rainy day in Hong Kong when he had offered not just financial backing, but something far more valuable: belief in my capabilities when I had almost lost faith in myself. Victoria had reached out earlier in the week. Her message a carefully worded attempt to position herself as an ally rather than an enemy. I had let the message sit unanswered, not out of spite, but because I recognized that she, like so many others, was still playing the old game of power and influence that I had moved beyond. The evening light painted shadows across the office as I reviewed the plans for my next major initiative, a comprehensive overhaul of how luxury real estate developments could incorporate community benefits without sacrificing profitability. It was the kind of project that would have seemed impossible in my previous life, when success was measured solely in dollars and square footage. "There's one more thing," Emma said, pulling up a final document. Alexander's lawyer reached out about a potential settlement. She paused, gauging my reaction. "They're offering to surrender control of the remaining properties in exchange for dropping the pending investigations." I felt a smile touch my lips, not of triumph but of understanding. "Send them our standard response about regulatory compliance and legal obligations," I replied. The woman I had been 18 months ago would have savored this moment of complete victory. Now, I recognized it as simply another business decision, one that would be made based on what served the greater good rather than personal satisfaction. Rising. From my desk, I moved back to the windows, watching as lights began to twinkle on across the city. Each one represented a story, a life, a potential for change. My reflection showed more than just a successful businesswoman. It showed someone who had learned that true power lies not in destroying others, but in building something meaningful from the ashes of destruction. The security team's evening report arrived, detailing the usual updates about building access and visitor logs. Buried in the middle was a note that Alexander had been seen leaving his last remaining office in the city, carrying boxes to his car. A year ago, this image would have filled me with vindictive joy. Now it barely registered as relevant to my path forward. Emma cleared her throat softly. "The Educational Foundation Board is waiting for your final approval on the scholarship program. Parameters." This initiative, using profits from my real estate empire to fund education for underprivileged students, represented everything I had learned about the true meaning of success. I picked up the proposal, noting how my hands no longer shook with suppressed emotion when handling documents that would impact Alexander's world. Instead, they moved with the steady purpose of someone who understood that every decision carried weight beyond personal victory or defeat. "Schedule a dinner with Isabella Torres next week," I instructed Emma. "I want to discuss expanding the educational initiative to include her hotel properties." Isabella, unlike many others, had recognized early on that my transformation was about more than just revenge. Her recent proposals for collaboration focused on sustainable development and community impact rather than mere profit. As night fell over San Francisco, I gathered my things, preparing to leave for the day. The office, once a symbol of my triumph over Alexander, had become something else entirely, a place where real change could be initiated, where power could be wielded not for personal gain, but for meaningful impact. My driver waited with the car, ready to take me not to the luxury penthouse Alexander had once coveted, but to my modest yet elegant apartment in Hayes Valley. I had chosen it not for its prestige, but for its proximity to the community I was working to improve. The woman who had once measured success in square footage and designer labels had evolved into someone who understood that true power lies in the ability to effect positive change. The city lights blurred past the car windows as we drove, each streetlight illuminating a path far different from the one I had originally set out on. My journey had begun as a quest for revenge, but it had led me to something far more valuable, an understanding of who I truly was and what I was capable of achieving. 6 months after the auction that had reshaped San Francisco's real estate landscape, I stood at the podium of the newly renovated Morrison Center for Community Development, formerly Alexander's prized Pacific Heights acquisition. The morning. Sun streamed through the vast windows, illuminating the faces of hundreds of attendees gathered for the center's inaugural ceremony. The symmetry of the moment wasn't lost on me. The very property that had once symbolized Alexander's greed had been transformed into a beacon of hope and opportunity for the community. The audience represented a striking cross-section of San Francisco society: community leaders, business, executives, education advocates, and residents from the surrounding neighborhoods. In the front row sat Li Wei, who had flown in from Hong Kong specifically for this event. His presence reminded me of how far I'd come from that rainy day when he had first offered his support and belief in my potential. 2 years ago, I began my address, my voice carrying clearly through the state-of-the-art auditorium. I learned a fundamental truth about power and purpose. The faces before me were attentive, many of them the same people who had witnessed my supposed downfall and subsequent rise. True success isn't measured by what we acquire, but by what we create. From my position on the stage, I could see Isabella Torres nodding appreciatively. Our partnership had evolved far beyond the initial business alliance, blossoming into a collaboration that was reshaping how luxury properties could serve both profit and purpose. The educational programs we had implemented across our combined properties were already showing promising results. Sarah Kavanaugh sat several rows back, her expression a mixture of respect and lingering regret. She had recently approached me about investing in the Community Development Initiative, a move that showed she too was beginning to understand that the old ways of doing business needed to evolve. I had accepted her investment, not out of forgiveness, but because every ally in this new mission mattered more than old grudges. Today, I continued, gesturing to the building around us, we're not just opening a community center. We're launching a new model for how real estate development can serve as a catalyst for positive change. The blueprints displayed on screens behind me showed not just this center, but 5 more planned developments across the city, each one designed to combine profitable business with meaningful community impact. Emma sat in the wings, tablet in hand, monitoring the live coverage of the event. The media narrative had shifted dramatically over the past 6 months, from sensational stories about real estate power plays to in-depth coverage of our innovative approach to urban development. The headline on the morning's Financial Times had read, "Morrison Global Ventures, Redefining Success in Real Estate." As I outlined our plans for the future, the job training programs, the educational initiatives, the small business incubator spaces, I caught sight of James Morrison slipping into the back of the auditorium. His presence was another sign of how thoroughly the industry had transformed. He had recently reached out about implementing similar community-focused programs in his own developments, finally understanding that the future of real estate lay not in exclusive luxury, but in inclusive prosperity. The true measure of success, I said, nearing the conclusion of my speech, lies not in what we build for ourselves, but in what we create for others. The words echoed through the space, carrying the weight of hard-won wisdom. I had learned this lesson through fire and transformation, through the journey from seeking revenge to finding purpose. The morning's news had carried the final notice of Alexander's bankruptcy filing. The information had crossed my desk without stirring any of the emotions it might have once provoked. His downfall was no longer the victory I savored. Instead, my satisfaction came from the knowledge that every property he had lost was being transformed into something that served a greater purpose. Victoria had relocated to London, according to the society pages. Her departure from San Francisco had been quiet, marked only by a brief note expressing her hope that some of our community development initiatives might be implemented in European markets. I had passed her message to our international development team, recognizing that good ideas could come from unexpected sources. After the ceremony, I hosted a small reception in the center's rooftop garden, a space that offered breathtaking views of the city I had grown to see in an entirely new light. Li Wei approached, raising his glass in a subtle toast. "You've created something remarkable," he observed, his eyes taking in the vibrant space around us. something far more valuable than mere revenge. He was right. The empire I had built extended far beyond physical properties and financial assets. It was an entirely new approach to real estate development, one that proved profit and purpose could coexist and even enhance each other. The quarterly reports showed our ventures were more successful than traditional luxury developments, attracting investors who recognized that sustainable, community-focused projects represented the future of urban development. Emma joined us, carrying the latest updates on our expanding initiatives. "The waiting list for the job training programs is growing," she reported, "and 3 more developers have reached out about implementing similar models in their properties." Each piece of news confirmed that we were creating not just buildings, but a movement. As the reception continued, I found myself drawn to the edge of the rooftop garden, looking out over the city that had witnessed my transformation. San Francisco. Stretched before me, a landscape of possibilities rather than a battlefield of power plays. Each building, each neighborhood, represented not just property value, but potential for positive change. My phone buzzed with a message from our development team. The permits for our next community center had been approved ahead of schedule. This one would be built in the heart of a neighborhood that desperately needed investment and opportunity. The project would include not just job training and educational facilities, but also affordable housing units and spaces for local businesses. The sun was setting over the bay, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that reflected off the surrounding buildings. As I watched the city transition from day to night, I realized that my journey had come full circle. The woman who had once sought revenge had found something far more powerful: the ability to create lasting, meaningful change. The future stretched out before me, filled not with the bitter satisfaction of revenge, but with the endless possibilities of purpose-driven success. Each new project, each community impacted, each life changed was another step forward on a path that led not to personal triumph, but to collective progress. In the end, I had not just reclaimed my power, I had redefined it entirely. 1 year to the day after the auction that had changed everything, I stood in my office at the top of the Millennium Tower, watching the first rays of dawn paint the San Francisco skyline in shades of gold and promise. The woman reflected in the window was both familiar and strange. The same features, but with an entirely different energy, transformed by the journey from victim to victor to visionary. The morning's Financial Times lay on my desk, its headline, capturing the extraordinary arc of my story. From bankruptcy to billions, how Catherine Morrison revolutionized San Francisco real estate. But it wasn't the headline that caught my eye. It was the smaller article below, announcing the launch of our 10th Community Development Center, this one in a neighborhood that Alexander had once dismissed as worthless. Emma entered with her usual quiet efficiency, carrying the morning's reports. "The final numbers are in from the first quarter," she announced, her voice carrying a note of satisfaction. "The community integrated development model has outperformed traditional luxury properties by 37%. She paused, allowing herself a small smile. "And Alexander's last remaining property was officially transferred to the bankruptcy trustees this morning." The news should have felt like the final victory in my long campaign of revenge, but instead, it barely registered as relevant. My attention was focused on the blueprints spread across my desk, plans for a revolutionary mixed-use development that would combine luxury units with affordable housing, educational facilities, and small business incubators. This was my legacy now, not the destruction of Alexander's empire. My phone buzzed with a message from Li Wei. "Investors in Singapore and Hong Kong are asking about implementing your community development model across Asia." The international interest in our approach had grown exponentially, proving that profit and purpose could coexist and even enhance each other. What had begun as a quest for revenge had evolved into a global movement for responsible real estate development. Victoria had recently given an interview to a London business magazine, crediting her experience in San Francisco with changing her perspective on property development. She was now working with community housing initiatives in the UK, proving that transformation was possible for anyone who was willing to learn from their experiences. Sarah Kavanaugh had become one of our strongest advocates, using her considerable influence to promote the integration of community benefits into luxury developments. Her recent projects all followed our model, proving that the old guard of real estate could adapt to new ways of thinking when shown a better path. The view from my office now represented something far different from what it had a year ago. Each building in the skyline was no longer just a property to be acquired or a symbol of power. It was an opportunity to create positive change, to blend prosperity with purpose in ways that benefited everyone. Isabella Torres entered my office, right on time for our morning meeting. Our partnership had blossomed into something that went far beyond business alliance. We were pioneering a new approach to urban development that was being studied by universities and emulated by developers. Worldwide, the Educational Foundation Board approved the expansion, she announced, settling into one of the chairs designed for comfort rather than intimidation. We'll be able to double the number of scholarships next year. The foundation, funded by profits from our real estate ventures, had already helped hundreds of students access educational opportunities they would never have had otherwise. James Morrison had recently reached out about collaborating on future projects, his message carrying a hint of the humility he had learned through watching the industry transform around him. I had agreed to meet, not out of forgiveness, but because every ally in this mission to reshape real estate development mattered more than old grievances. The morning sun continued its journey across the sky, illuminating the city I had come to see in an entirely new light. Each street, each building, each neighborhood held potential not just for profit, but for positive change. The woman who had once sought revenge had found something far more powerful: the ability to create lasting, meaningful impact. Emma returned with updates from our international division. The Asian partnerships are expanding faster than projected, she reported, and the European market is showing strong interest in our integrated development model. What had begun as a local victory had grown into a global movement, proving that success could be measured in more than just dollars and square feet. My phone buzzed again, this time with news that the City Council had unanimously approved our latest development proposal. The project would transform a forgotten corner of the city into a vibrant community hub, complete with affordable housing, educational facilities, and spaces for local businesses to thrive. Looking out over the city I now helped shape, I reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought me here. The bankruptcy that Alexander had orchestrated to destroy me had instead become the catalyst for my greatest triumph, not just in reclaiming my power, but in discovering an entirely new way to wield it. The woman who had walked into that auction room a year ago, armed with plans for revenge, had been transformed by her own victory. In seeking to destroy Alexander's empire, I had discovered something far more valuable: the ability to build something meaningful, something that would outlast any personal vendetta. The sun now sat high in the sky, its light reflecting off the buildings that stood as monuments not to personal power, but to the possibility of positive change. Each property in my portfolio told a story not of revenge accomplished, but of communities strengthened, opportunities created, and lives transformed. The final page of the morning's report contained a small note that would have once been the centerpiece of my day. Alexander had been seen leaving the city, heading for the airport with a single suitcase. But the news barely registered. I was too focused on the future to spare much thought for the past. As I prepared for my next meeting, this one with a group of international developers interested in implementing our community-integrated model, I caught my reflection in the window once more. The woman looking back at me was neither victim nor victor, but something far more powerful: a visionary who had transformed personal tragedy into universal opportunity. The empire I had built stood, not as a monument to revenge, but as proof that success could be measured in more than just personal triumph. Each building, each project, each initiative was a testament to the truth I had discovered along the way, that the greatest victory lies not in destroying what others have built, but in creating something that enriches everyone it touches. Thus, the sun reached its zenith, bathing the city in the full light of day. And I knew with absolute certainty that my journey had never really been about reclaiming what I had lost. It had been about discovering who I could become. And in that discovery, finding a purpose far greater than revenge could ever provide. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.